It is 9 o'clock and good evening. I'm Cordell Wright.
I'm Andrea Anderson. Over the past 8 months, the Sioux Falls Childcare Collaborative has been conducting research into the childcare crisis in the city.
At a meeting tonight on the campus of USD in Sioux Falls, they revealed their findings and recommendations. It's our top story tonight.
The tendency is to think, well, I don't have kids that age, it doesn't really affect me, but this affects our entire community.
The importance of bringing together a bunch of different groups who can all play a part in that is really important. And what you're going to hear tonight in the solutions is a multifaceted approach that we're going to need to take as a community.
Woo-hoo, good job. What the Sioux Falls Child Care Collaborative found during their research study can be quite staggering, such as the fact the average hourly wage for a child care worker in the city was only $12.34, which in turn is why 64% of child care centers can enroll to their licensed capacity due to workforce challenges.
Can you show me, Violet?
Looking at competing against retail and fast food chains, that's difficult because of the just kind of broken, unsustainable model of childcare as it is today.
They also found that a family with only one child would need to make more than $163,000 to afford childcare at current rates, but the median household income in Sioux Falls is under $67,000.
This issue right now is affecting families that make a significant wage, but because the child care costs have increased so dramatically, even those families are having to choose between entering the workforce or staying home and caring for their children because they can't simply do both.
The group's solutions come in a three-pronged approach, starting at the state level.
South Dakota is one of 6 states that does not put any state funding towards child care assistance, and so really looking at, are there ways that we can change that and kind of follow along with what other states are already doing?
Where's the circle go?
A business level.
What does that look like to be a family-friendly business? If you're someone or an employer that is really focused on supporting your staff members, what are some of the things that you can do as a business to continue to support those families?
And a local level.
Looking at our funders, looking at the community organizations and nonprofits, how can we work together to start to enact these recommendations, and which ones are we going to move forward on first?
I'm going to put the green ones.
Some of the recommendations include creating an Office of Child and Youth Development, providing business incentive grants, and increasing the pathways into the child care profession. You can find a full detailed list of the collaboration's recommendations by following the links with this story on the Dakota News Now website.